I think one of the greatest sources of insight that you have are the questions that your students will ask. Over a number of years, I've had a practice of using my iPad. Now, I'm not recommending this, I'm just describing this, okay? We had 15,000 students in the BYU Idaho auditorium. I give them a phone number, and they then can anonymously text questions to my iPad. And that night, let me make sure I don't embellish this, I got 14,000 questions. When you read those questions, it's one of the greatest learning experiences anybody can have who's working with young people. And I am of the opinion that we have no idea where they are. When you read those questions and they're anonymous, and they're really asking what they're troubled by and what they need help with. How do we know what to say until we know where they are? Instead of thinking, what am I going to tell them? The focus is on what would I ask them? And not only what would I ask them, but what would I invite them to do? The very act of asking them that question is inviting them to act. So our instinct ought to be not, what do I tell them? But the question is, what can I invite them to do? What inspired question can I ask, which if they are willing to respond, will begin to invite the Holy Ghost into that person's life. That individual is inviting the Holy Ghost to answer the question. And our role is to make it safe to discuss those things and to invite them to act so that the Holy Ghost can teach. And a part of what we always want to do in the Western world is, here's the formula for asking the right question. If you love the kids and you look at them, and you listen to them. The questions are not complicated. You're just trying to find out where they are because you really care.
So as a mother of very young children, that having a dialogue like we're having isn't always possible, how can I apply this pattern to teaching my children and allowing the Spirit to be the one that's teaching them? Line upon line, precept upon precept. Obviously, small children have to be directed, instructed, and so forth. But at the earliest possible moment, you throttle back just a little bit, and it can only be microscopic. But each one of those is a line upon line, precept upon precept. As your children get older and you recognize that you have less and less control over what they do, they're influenced by friends and they become their own little people, then many parents will tend to talk more and more and more and more with the understanding that, well, if I just say this enough times, they're going to get it. And it may be the case that the more times it gets said, the more it guarantees they don't get it. I'm not saying that parents don't direct and counsel, correct, all of those things. But it is remarkable to me, in doing this pattern with young people, let me describe one episode that I think is very characteristic. I had been inviting questions from young people for almost an hour and a half. I then asked the adults, what have you learned from this pattern? And amidst the comments, one sister stood up and she said, Brother Bednar, your answers are really quite simple. And frankly, we could give these answers to these young people if they would just ask us the questions. And one young man raised his hand. He stood up and he said, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but we'd never ask the adults our questions because they don't listen. And it was just stunning. And I think there's an element of truth in it. Because we just talk and talk and talk and talk, and we think we're teaching, but that's not teaching. It's a part of teaching. I'm not saying you just sit and listen, but there ought to be perhaps less talking and more listening, and you develop that line upon line, precept upon precept.